Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about monsters, but these are some monsters that a lot of people have never heard of, or very few people have heard of. Not your typical Kraken, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster kind of thing, but the creatures that are out there that just don't get a whole lot of publicity. Many years ago, when I had a job, there was a detail called sign cutting, one of my most favorite activities. You'd go looking for footprints made by folks here illegally. Now, there was a lot more to it than just looking for footprints. You had to look for the sign that people left once they destroyed any footprints. They would do all kinds of crazy things trying to get by us, and we would do all kinds of strange things to try to catch them. Some of the things done to get by were downright ingenious. One time we followed a group to a fence between the Alexander and the Thompson ranches. A good-sized group that did their best to disguise their tracks. We followed them right up to the 8-foot-high deer fence. The tracks all crossed the dirt road on the Alexander side, but there was nothing on the other side except old tire tracks from a pickup. We tracked back and forth looking at the dirt, trying to figure out where the aliens went. Now, it was pretty obvious that the truck tires were a lot older than the human tracks. One of the guys walking the brush around 50 yards in on the Thompson side suddenly found their footprints. We got on them again and finally found the group had held up at one of the tanks. A tank was a huge dirt pit dug out by the rancher to catch and hold rainwater for their cattle. Being a bunch of brushwalkers, we talked back and forth, and one of them told us that when the group came to the Thompson-Alexander fence, they crossed the dirt road on the Thompson side, being careful to step in each other's footprints. Then the last guy in the group walked backwards, brushing out the footprints, and then he used a stick to carefully draw the tire tracks back into the dirt. This guy was very talented. This was one of those groups that we used to catch several times over the course of many years, and it was almost like we knew them. We knew their families, we knew where they lived. You get to talking, especially when you're out in the middle of nowhere and you've got a long drive or a long walk ahead of you. A lot of these guys usually came from the same small towns in Mexico. These folks were polite, honest, hard workers who would walk anywhere from 100 to several hundred miles, heading to a ranch where they already knew the owners. These folks carried everything they needed. They knew where to find water and where to take care not to leave any sign of their passing. Not all brushwalkers were decent people. There were drug smugglers who also walked these ranches. The only way to find out which kind of people you were dealing with was to catch them. Now, sign cutting is a skill nearly exclusive to the Border Patrol. It's a form of tracking used to find groups of people crossing the border and proceeding towards the interior of the U.S., and It sounds a lot easier than it is. It's amazing how many people would put in for that detail only to find out about a week into it that they wish they hadn't. Hot, dry, middle of nowhere, and none of our vehicles had air conditioning. The people leaving the tracks don't want to be found, so they try to disguise their trail through bizarre means. Walking backwards, brushing the tracks out with a branch, or covering their shoes with material. To a good sign cutter, these are just mere distractions. You're not just looking at the tracks, but enough on that, we don't want to give away any secrets. 2010, Agent Chavez was working the evening shift when he spotted the sign of a group of 6 people crossing Mines Road, heading from west to east. He drove his Tahoe along the road to determine the direction of travel so he could alert other agents working the area. The group were brushwalkers, but there was no telling if they were workers or smugglers. Other agents gathered in the area, and they began walking out the sign. This meant they'd left their vehicles and they were walking along through the mesquite and the ratama bushes, following the trail created by the aliens. While working sign, you have to use stealth. No flashlights, no noise. If they are smugglers and they know you're on their trail, they will use any means available, which includes shooting at the agents. Eddie drove through the ranch to the next fence line so he could get a hold of the group. By keeping part of the search party in front and part in back, they kind of would catch him in the middle. Or, if he caught sign of the aliens crossing the next fence line, he would notify the guys walking and then get on the tracks himself. Eddie, as he was driving along the fence, spotted 2 females coming towards his vehicle. They looked haggard and uneasy as they hurried in his direction. They both kept looking over their shoulders as if looking for some pursuer. Most brushwalkers know that if they get into trouble, either they get sick or they get lost, the Border Patrol will take care of them, which includes medical. Eddie was a paramedic, as well as being an agent. The women told him there's something chasing them. Well, Agent Chavez had worked the area on numerous occasions. He knew there were cattle in most of the fields, but cows will shy away from anybody walking through their pastures. Coyotes run every square foot of this part of Texas, but they tend to avoid human contact. Mountain lions will chase down anything, or anyone, they think they can make a meal out of, but you won't know there's a giant cat following you until it's too late. Agent Chavez asked the women what they were afraid of. The 2 women informed him something big as an elephant, had been on their trail for over a half hour. They'd seen this huge black, what looked like a hairy-covered creature following behind them, so the group had run for as long as they could. When exhaustion set in, they'd taken refuge in a thick clump of brush and lay there in the dark hoping this thing would go away. As they were laying there, they could hear the creature moving through the darkness. It sounded like it was circling their position. They lay there in the dark, shaking in their boots literally, when one of the women spotted the green and white vehicle driving along the fence line in front of them. They both, her and the other woman, leaped to their feet and ran towards the vehicle, figuring it was far better to take refuge with an armed agent than lay there in the dark without any weapons. As soon as the women got to the vehicle, the men soon joined them. They began telling the same story. Some huge, black, hairy creature had been chasing them through the dark. The group were more than happy to get in the back of the vehicle and get the heck out of there. When it was determined the group were not carrying any drugs and had not been deported, they were returned to Mexico, taking their chilling stories with them. Having worked the brush for over 26.5 years, I've seen some odd things. You hear sounds all around in the dark. If you let your imagination run wild, you might just convince yourself there's something out there, big and nasty and horrible, if you're that kind of a person. These brushwalkers spend most of their lives living, working, sleeping, and eating in the country. These people are not city folks. They know what is and what isn't out there. So for them to have imagined this adventure is highly unlikely. What they needed, to be believed, would be for somebody else to come along and corroborate their story. 2011, about a year later, east from the first encounter, a group of OTMs, that's other than Mexicans, were walking through the brush. This is the official designation for aliens who are not from Mexico. This group of 2 men and 3 women were traveling through the ranch just to the east of where the 6 had been caught last year. The OTMs had crossed the ranch very close to where the others had their bizarre encounter. At some point in their travel, something began to follow. They became aware of the sound as whatever it was broke some branches as it passed behind them. At first, the aliens thought it might be a bull, but in the dim light, they spotted what looked like a large, hair-covered creature somewhat like a gorilla, only a lot bigger, crashing through the brush as it moved around their position. The group was overcome with fear, not knowing what the dark might bring. They sought the refuge of a thick clump of mesquite and tried to hide. This creature began to circle their position. It would move around them, never getting close enough to see clearly, but always staying in their vicinity. It kept the group trapped there for over an hour and a half. Imagine the fear as they lay there in the dark, watching as this tall, black form would pass in front and then behind them. They had no means to defend themselves. Agent Chavez was working in the same area when he saw the sign of the 5 crossing the fence from one ranch to the next. He followed them, opening gates as he came to them. We used to have some massive key rings. I had to turn mine in when I left. You always opened any gate, you closed it if it was closed, and you always left any gate open that you found open. One of the rules of sign cutting. As he was driving along the dirt road looking for the group, they spotted him and came running. When Agent Chavez saw this group of 5 aliens running towards him through the dark, it immediately brought back the memory of what had happened last year. A group of aliens had become overcome with fear after being chased by something through the brush. So, he asked the group what they were afraid of. All 5 members of the group gave the same story. A large, black, hair-covered thing, walking on 2 legs, but kind of walking like a gorilla, the way they used their knuckles, and it had chased them for some time. Even among the people crossing the border illegally, there's a pecking order. You have the smugglers. They're at the top. They consider everybody else to be subhuman and not to be trifled with. If an alien in the group gets too sick to continue, the smugglers have been known to simply walk off and leave them in the middle of nowhere. They've also been known to steal all the possessions of the people in their company, including their food and water, abandoning them in the middle of nowhere to die. Smugglers, not nice people. The brushwalkers are decent people who are just passing through looking for work, but they don't usually associate with anyone not from their hometown. The same bunch of people will travel, live, and work together the entire time they're in our country. Then there's the OTMs. Not being native to Mexico, they're not treated well by the authorities or some inhabitants of Mexico. The police have been known to arrest people from South and Central America, take all their money, and then throw them out of the country. If the United States border just happens to be the closest, they will throw them into the United States. The chances are the first group would not have spent any time conversing with the second group. The two encounters sound to me as if they actually happened. The big question is, what was this thing that both these groups of people encountered? Big, black, covered with hair, walks kind of like a gorilla and sometimes on two legs, as big as an elephant, and is it still out there? The Enfield Monster was a creature reported in Enfield, Illinois, April 1973. As more folks saw this creature, it was reported in the newspapers and on TV. Some of the sightings sounded like a huge ape or Sasquatch-looking beast, while others sounded almost like a kangaroo. It could have been the witnesses were seeing two different creatures, or they were not getting a good look at it, and their minds were filling in too many blanks. The timeline is a bit screwed up. In one account, a young boy named Garrett said he had been attacked by a monster that tore up his shoes. It could have been he'd been abusing his footwear, unless the account followed his were also just an excuse for bad behavior. Garrett came storming in through the back door of his home, yelling and screaming. His folks had been watching TV and had to calm him down to get the story. He said he'd been attacked by a 4 or a 5 foot tall monster. This creature had gray, slimy skin, long claws on its hands, and it stood on 3 legs. His shoes were torn up, and they did look as if they'd been clawed at. The creature hadn't so much attacked as run past him, and its claws had done the damage. Garrett's parents said their son wasn't prone to making up stories, and he usually took care of his things. In another account, this happened days later after other people had reported their encounters. A short time later, their neighbor, Henry McDaniel, and his wife returned home at 9:30. They found their kids, Henry and Lil, in a panic. They told their parents that some kind of a weird creature was scraping at the house, trying to get in. McDaniel listened to their story, thinking they'd been mistaken by some kind of a unknown object that had just scared them. They'd let their imagination get to them. As he was trying to explain away the incident, he heard something like a scratching sound coming from outside. McDaniel looked out the window, and he saw what he thought was a bear scratching at the side of his house. He grabbed his pistol and opened the front door, only to come face to face with the Enfield Monster. He said it had 3 legs, a short body, 2 short arms, and 2 pink eyes as big as flashlights. It stood 4 to 4.5 feet tall, and it had grayish-colored skin. He also said that it almost looked like a human, only it was badly deformed. McDaniel fired 4 shots at the creature. One shot hit it, causing it to make a hissing sound, a lot like a wildcat. The creature took off towards the nearby railway embankment, covering 50 feet in a very quick time. McDaniel called the local authorities, who discovered footprints in the soft earth near the house, which McDaniel described as kind of dog-like in shape, only they had 6 toes. The Great Pyrenees have 6 toes, but 2 of these are dew claws. If it doesn't have 6 toes, it's not a purebred. The police considered McDaniel to be rational and sober in his reporting of the incident. In a later press interview, McDaniel said, "If they do find it, they will find more than one, and they won't be from this planet." I've never heard of any kind of a cryptid with only 3 legs. Odd numbers don't happen in nature. 2 legs, 4, 6, even 8, but not 3 or 5. Investigators interviewed nearby residents who told them that Greg Garrett, the 10-year-old neighbor of McDaniels, said he'd encountered the creature half an hour before McDaniels did, and that the creature had stomped on his feet, tearing his tennis shoes to shreds. 2 weeks later, May 6th, McDaniels called the radio station WWKI saying he'd seen the creature again, only at 3 a.m. in the morning. The thing was crossing the trestles of the railroad track near his home. McDaniel said, "I saw something moving out on the railroad tracks, and there it stood. I didn't shoot at it or anything. It just started on down the railroad tracks. It wasn't in a hurry or anything." A search party, including WWKI's news director Rick Rainbow, explored the area later that day, and they observed an ape-like creature standing in an abandoned building near McDaniel's house. They said they made a recording of the creature's cries and then fired a shot at it before it disappeared. A cryptozoologist, Lorne Coleman, investigated the case, and he listened to the sound recording. Unfortunately, today, you can't find the recording anywhere. The day after McDaniels was interviewed on the local radio, the local press reported that police were called to investigate reports of gunfire. They found 5 young men, all mostly drunk, all carrying weapons. These men were from out of town. They were arrested for drunk and disorderly. The sheriff said none of these men mentioned the Enfield Monster until after they had been arrested. This was when they claimed they were hunting the monster and the weapons were for their protection. The men said they had seen the monster and fired at it. The sheriff went on to say these men were just there making trouble, and they were all charged with hunting violations as well as being drunk. The incidents were reported widely in the newspapers and on the radio. WGN out of Chicago ran the story. WGN was one of the most powerful radio stations in operation in the 70s. At night, we could listen to Chicago in League City, over 1,000 miles away. This was back when stations would go off the air at night so they didn't interfere with each other. At sundown, an AM radio station could travel miles. It's one of those weird phenomena that people today who listen to the radios on their computers and their smartphones won't understand. With the story being spread throughout the country, the folks living in Enfield began to see monster hunters coming into town looking to make a name for themselves. The common thought was these people didn't really know what they were doing, and they would more than likely shoot somebody's cow or maybe somebody. The old circus train crash was hauled out and dusted off. People began saying there had been a circus train derailment and some exotic animals had escaped, and this is what everybody was seeing. Then people began to say it was just a kangaroo that people were seeing. The third leg was supposed to be the tail. The last time the Infield Monster was seen was in May. It was seen once again walking along the railroad tracks heading out of town, and it's never been seen again. The folks who had reported seeing the monster all said it was not a kangaroo. McDaniel had shot the thing. It simply hissed and ran away. Some people said it looked more like an ape, a very big ape. The idea of a kangaroo running loose causing havoc isn't all that new. In Hamburg, Arkansas, back in January 1934, people were seeing what they called a killer kangaroo. Ranchers and farmers were finding their livestock, mostly small animals like goats, sheep, ducks, dead, drained of blood. When they decided to take up arms and track down the killer, they encountered a creature that they described looked like a giant kangaroo. The hunting party chased the creature south from their area, unable to get close enough for a shot. The beast vanished into a wooded area and was never seen again. The weird killings stopped right after the creature was chased off. The Illinois State Police found many tracks of some unknown creature. The tracks were 4 inches across. None of these prints looked anything like kangaroo tracks. I'm sorry, that was the Arkansas police. I contacted the newspaper in that town. I tried talking to the different people to see if I could maybe find an archived copy of the newspaper, but unfortunately they told me they don't keep newspapers from that long ago. So the Hamburg, Arkansas incident, I don't know if it ever happened or not, but I have read about it, so who knows. Churubusco is a small settlement founded in 1847. This was during the Mexican-American War, and the residents decided to name their new town after a major U.S. victory in Churubusco, Mexico. Folks living there sometimes shortened the name to Busco. In 1898, the people living there began reporting a monster living in nearby Falk Lake. The lake was on a farmer's property. His name was Oscar Falk, and so the lake took on his name. The monster was said to be as big as a dining room table, about 6 to 8 feet across. Oscar was out working in his field when he spotted this huge creature in the lake. It was oval-shaped, and after looking at it for a while, he thought maybe it was a giant turtle. The farm changed hands over the years, and Gail Harris was the owner in 1948. Harris would allow people to use the lake for fishing. One day, 2 men, Charles Wilson and Ora Blue, were on the lake in their boat. They spotted a 6-foot shell rising out of the water. It had spikes jutting out from it, making the men say it was an alligator snapping turtle. Wilson and Blue returned to shore, where they told Harris about the sighting. According to the Michigan Quarterly Review, Harris didn't necessarily believe them. However, days later, him and his friend Orville Reese were repairing the barn roof when they spotted the turtle out in the lake. Wanting to get a better look, the two rowed out on the lake. From that day on, Harris told anyone that would listen about the monster turtle living in his property. People began to come from all around to try to see the huge turtle that became known as Oscar after the original owner of the farm. The naysayers said Harris was just telling tales. Wanting to prove the giant turtle was real, on March 1949, Harris built a trap to try to catch Oscar. People don't realize just how powerful a monster turtle can be. The trap was made of wood and chicken wire. It lasted just long enough for Oscar to completely demolish it. Then Harris got a hold of a 300-foot net, and he tried dragging it across the lake. Once more, this was just an annoyance to the turtle, who snagged the uh, the thing and just tore it to pieces. The net came up, well, parts of it came back up. Several other attempts were made, like bringing in a sea turtle, hoping that Oscar would come by for a visit. Snapping turtles don't usually hang out with sea turtles. One is a freshwater creature, while the other one lives in saltwater. Two divers were willing to give it a try, entered the water, and swam looking for the giant. Equipment malfunctions brought this attempt to an abrupt end. Later on, a second diving attempt was made. One of the divers got stuck on the bottom and needed to be rescued. The idea of using divers was put on hold. Harris was going to try dynamite to kill Oscar so that he could prove that it was real. This was met with a lot of nasty looks. People wanted to see the turtle and know that it was alive. A dead turtle just wasn't that big of a draw. So the folks in town convinced him, don't go out there and kill the thing. Later, in 1949, Harris decided he was going to drain the lake. He brought in a pump, and hundreds of spectators came to watch. As the water level was going down, everything in the lake was slowly pushed into a small area. Oscar was seen as his head popped up to the surface and swallowed a duck in one bite. Shortly after that, the pump broke. Before it could be fixed, it began to rain, and the level of the lake slowly came back up. Harris made a final attempt to drag the lake with a crane. Unfortunately, the hunt for the turtle had severely damaged Harris's reputation as well as his finances. He was forced to finally give up the search in December 1949 due to health issues and a lack of money. The farm was sold less than a year later, and Oscar's never been seen again. 1950, the town held its first official Turtle Day festival, and they've been holding it every year since. They have turtle races, parades, live music, and a 5K run. The Whitley County Historical Museum holds a few historical items from the turtle hunts. There's even a children's book on the subject. As for Oscar, folks still believe he's alive and well, either sitting on the bottom of Falk Lake or maybe he moved on to some less dynamic location, a lake with fewer people trying to catch him. Some turtles do grow to enormous size. The Leatherback Sea Turtle gets up to 6 feet in length and weighs over 1,000 pounds. There's no reason a snapping turtle, if left on its own with enough food, couldn't just keep growing. The lake is on private property, but you can still see it from the road nearby, in case you want to go have a look. The Mogalon Monster is a Bigfoot-type creature that originated from the Mogollon Ridge in Arizona. Any large hair-covered creature is called a Bigfoot type, even if it has characteristics different from most Bigfoot sightings. Reports of footprints, videos, and hair samples have been documented, but no conclusive evidence has been found, nothing that the naysayers will accept as proof. Until a Bigfoot walks into town and sits down for an interview, the skeptics won't believe in him. And even then, there are going to be those who will say, nah, not real. The Mogalon Monster is reported to be a bipedal humanoid, 7 feet tall, with inhuman strength. He has large eyes that people say look bright red. Its body is covered with long black or reddish-brown hair. Now the chest, face, and hands and feet are hairless. The creature has a strong, pungent odor described as smelling like dead fish or maybe a skunk. The creature is omnivorous, nocturnal, and very violent. It is generally reported to walk with a wide inhuman stride, leaving behind footprints measuring 22 inches in length. It makes a whistling sound or sometimes a scream. People report having their campsites explored during the night. It is also believed to consume deer and other wildlife after killing them by ripping the heads off. Reported sightings range all along the Mogollon Rim from Prescott, Arizona to Williams, Arizona, southeast to Alpine, and then over to Clifton. The oldest known documented sighting of the Mogalon Monster was reported in 1903 edition of the Arizona Republican. I.W. Stevens described a creature seen near the Grand Canyon, having long white hair and a matted beard that reached to his knees. It was completely naked, and on its fingers were what looked like claws 2 inches long. The coat of gray hair nearly covered his body, with dirty-looking skin showing through at the face, chest, hands, and feet. He later stated that after he discovered the creature drinking the blood of 2 cougars, it threatened him with a club and screamed the wildest, most unearthly screech. Another early documented sighting was recounted by cryptozoologist Don Davis. During the mid-1940s, he was on a Boy Scout trip in nearby Payson, Arizona. The creature was huge. Its eyes were deep-set and hard to see, but they seemed expressionless. His face seemed pretty much devoid of hair, but there seemed to be hair along the sides of his face. His chest, shoulders, and arms were massive, especially the upper arms. He said I could see he was pretty hairy, but he didn't observe really how thick the body hair was. The face and the head were very square sides and squared-up chin, like a box. Now, most Bigfoot sightings say they have a conical-shaped head, and the face is covered with hair as well. 2006, a member of the White Mountain Apache Nation in Arizona said, "We're not prone to easily talk to outsiders, but there have been more sightings than ever before. It can't be ignored any longer. No one's had a negative encounter with it. It was all black, and it was tall. The way it walked, it was taking big strides." The person said, "I put on the brakes and raced back and looked between the 2 trees where it was, but it was gone." The tribal police lieutenant stated that a couple of times they've seen this creature looking in through windows. The people reporting are scared when they call. The calls they were getting came in from people who weren't hallucinating. They weren't drunks. They weren't people that were known to make hoax calls. He said that they were from real citizens of the Fort Apache Indian Reservation. The cornfield creature sightings are some of the creepiest things going. If you've never been in a cornfield in the middle of the night, well, you just don't know what you're missing. Usually, well, just about always, cornfields are way out away from populated areas. Driving past cornfields, you're pretty much isolated from everyone. If you live near them, your closest neighbors might be miles away. A witness was working at a cheese factory which was located in the middle of a bunch of cornfields. The place was in Minnesota, and it was a vast sea of corn. In the summer of 2004, the witness was taking a break on the night shift. Stepping outside, he was looking out over the cornfield, watching bats fly back and forth, munching on the bugs that were drawn in by the nearby lights. Something moving in the corn caught his eye. It made him look down at the edge of the cornfield. He could see there was something moving through the rows. It was small, the size of a child, but extremely skinny. The skin was pale, with what looked like long black hair on its head. It moved in short, jerky gait, like someone dancing, but very badly. Its movements were jerky. The legs, the hips, then the torso and the shoulders. It was looking back into the cornfield. The sighting made the witness feel intensely nervous. Something just wasn't right about this thing. As he stood there watching this creature, he suddenly became aware of the fact that it was extremely quiet all of a sudden. All the nighttime bugs and birds had fallen silent, and the bats were no longer flying. At first he thought maybe it was some kind of a bird, maybe, like a heron, only it looked like a person, a very, very skinny person. It didn't move like anyone. Gradually, step by step, it moved closer. Letting his curiosity get the better of him, he moved towards the edge of the loading dock, which was raised a few feet up off the ground. When the witness got within a few feet of the edge, the thing looked up at him. He stood there paralyzed as the creature looked back. It moved. Its face still pointed in his direction. It ratcheted its body in that disconcerting, jerky movement towards the cornfield and disappeared into it. The witness could follow its movements as the corn stalks were shaking over its head. Eventually, the movement died away. Wondering what he'd seen, he continued staring into the field for an hour, but it was gone. For weeks after that, he would stand on the loading dock watching for the creature's return, but it was a one-time deal. The next witness lived in Indiana, on a hill that sat out in the middle of a cornfield. There were intermittent wooded areas in the distance. One day she went out exploring. Young girl, nothing better to do. It's hard to walk through a cornfield. Not like in the movie Signs. Corn stalks are close together, and you can't see anything but corn. There are roads built between the stalks so the farmers and his workers can move about without damaging the crops. As she had followed one of these roads to the wooded area, having seen what was there, she turned and started back. A movement caught her eye. She turned in the direction and saw a black shape. It was gone before she could get a good look. She turned back to her house and continued walking. A sound came to her right from behind. The thing was on the road right behind her. It stood there looking at her. Its head was held to one side as if its neck were broken. It stood about 4 feet tall, with really long arms that hung down past its knees. There was no hair anywhere on its body, which looked like it had been burned. There was what looked like steam coming from it. The thing exuded a feeling of pure evil. The bad feeling overwhelmed her, and she took off running as fast as she could for the house. This would be one of those times you say to yourself, I wish I'd spent more time running and less time on the couch. Her heart was pounding and she couldn't get enough air. The sound of it coming along behind her was getting louder. The thought came to her, what would happen if this thing caught her? She risked a quick look back. The thing ran like a gorilla, using its arms to help propel itself along the road. It was gaining on her. It made a gurgling sound as it came. She reached her front door seconds ahead of the thing. Charging into the house, she slammed the door and locked it. Her mother heard the noise and came running to see what was wrong. The girl tried to explain what had been chasing her. As she was telling her story, they both heard something begin pounding on the side of the house. The pounding would move along the wall as if the creature was looking for a way in. Well, this led to a lot of screaming on the parts of the daughter and mother. That's something I can't understand why people do it. They get scared and so they scream. It doesn't really do anything. It's right up there with passing out. Very useful thing to do when you're being chased by a monster. I think I'll just pass out so the thing can catch me and eat me. After an hour of tormenting them, pounding on the walls on all sides of the building, the sound stopped. It took a while to figure out that it was gone. When her father got home, they tried to explain what had happened. She really thought her father was going to laugh at her, say that she was just scared of nothing. Instead, he went and got his rifle. Then he got on the phone, calling his friends to come over and help search the property. They formed up into groups and began looking everywhere a 4-foot-tall creature could hide. They never found it. Later that night, her father told them he had been out in the field burning leaves when he'd seen something that looked just like what had chased her. It had let out an ear-piercing shriek before vanishing into the woods. Over the next few weeks, there were 7 other reports of something in the cornfield, something 4 feet tall, black, and very evil-looking. In Illinois comes an account of a witness who says that her encounter happened while driving her husband along a rural road in central Illinois that passed right through an expanse of cornfields. I've driven through this area. It gets old looking at corn for hours on end. In the winter, it looks like a sea of white. You can't tell where the road is and where the fields begin. The witness saw something running across the road right in front of them. She said it looked like the size of a toddler, about 3 or 4 feet tall. Its arms and legs looked extremely skinny, like a skeleton, too thin to support its body. The witness had taken biology classes in college, and she knew what animals and people were supposed to look like. She asked her husband if he'd seen it, and he looked up just as the thing left the side of the road. It was moving faster than any person or animal should have been able to go. 2018 in Knox County, Ohio, the witness was driving home in the afternoon. His route took him through a bunch of cornfields. A bipedal, hairless thing came running from one side of the road. He said it was 7 or 8 feet tall. The thing was slender to the point of looking almost like a skeleton. The hands and feet looked too big for the rest of the body. The head looked like an elongated oval. It crossed the road and vanished into the cornfield on the other side of the road. There was another sighting in Washington County, Ohio, near the town of Churchtown. It was July 1984, and the witness was 17 at the time. He said he'd gone to see a fireworks festival in the nearby town of Beverly, and he was on his way back, taking some roads through a bunch of darkened cornfields. The road was rough and winding, so he was driving slowly, about 15 to 20 miles an hour. He rounded a slight curve where the banks on either side of the road rose about 6 feet. On both sides of the road were fences and cornfields. On the left side of the road, behind the fence, was a large, hair-covered, gray or white-colored figure standing by the fence. The young man was stunned, and he didn't know what he was seeing or if he should do anything but drive. He kept going, driving along slowly, looking at the thing. As he went by, the thing just looked back. The two just looked back and forth, and then the car was passed. The witness got home wondering what it was that he could do to find out more on the thing he'd just seen. A white Bigfoot, maybe? And just about every Bigfoot sighting is either brown or reddish brown color. The Yeti is not white. Every report of a Yeti sighting say that they are either brown or red. The only reason people think that the Yeti is white is because they saw one in a movie where the creature was white. What was the name of that movie? Frosty the Snowman. Oh, correction. No, it was Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Since that movie came out, everybody just thinks that the Yetis are white, but they're not. They're brown or red. In 1997, there was a similar report from nearby town of Belvedere in Franklin County, Tennessee. A pair of female cousins were out driving in a new car. They drove through the cornfields after sundown, mostly just enjoying having a new car, not expecting to see anything odd. On the side of the road, a huge, white, hair-covered creature with a cone-shaped head stepped from the corn stalks. Corn stalks can get up to 8 feet tall. This creature's head was visible above the corn. They had the high beams on, and they were able to see this creature crossing the road and into the darkness beyond the fence. After this encounter, the pair just wanted to get back home. They told their families what they'd seen, a white Bigfoot, maybe. They just called it a monster. The owner of the car's brother said that he ran into a similar creature only a few days later in the woods near their house. He said he saw a white creature covered in hair moving through the trees. It was not all that far from the cornfield where his sister and cousin had seen their Bigfoot-type creature. The next story comes from, I'll call him George. I had to use names because there's so many different people in this story, it would get confusing otherwise. When George was about 12, him and his friend would play in a cornfield around the house. One field was about 1.5 miles long. They'd been playing in the field for several years. One night they noticed there was a light in the middle of the field. They walked out to where the light was, and they found there was a house in the middle of all that corn. There'd never been a house there before, as long as they could remember. The house looked like it had been there for years. The lights were all on, and it looked like there were people living in it. Thinking this was something out of a horror movie, the two boys ran for home. It took them several days before they could draw up the courage to go have another look to see if the house was really there. It was gone, and there was no sign of a house ever having been where they'd seen it. Well, not really a monster, but maybe a monster house? Yes, I saw that movie, and, well, it was okay. In Wynn, Michigan, West Co. Road wanders back and forth through a large stretch of cornfields. In 2003, a truck driver says he was taking the road at 2 p.m. on a clear day when a creature described as dark, dirty, man-like, but not a man, came crashing out of the cornfields. It stood there and watched as he drove by. Some locals say that they have seen something large and hairy moving through the corn in that area from time to time. They say it looks more like a man than an ape, but it's covered with hair, and it's extremely tall. A woman was driving a van full of kids to Chicago. They were passing through a sea of cornfields on I-55. Nothing but corn as far as the eye could see. Everybody in the van was asleep except for the teenager who was sitting on the passenger seat. Up ahead, on the far side of the barbed wire fence, they saw two young kids step out from the corn. They were both dressed a bit odd. They looked as if they were going to a dance or something. As the van got closer, the two witnesses could see the boy had dirt and what looked like maybe blood on his shirt. He had suspenders holding up dark brown pants. The girl had on a fancy dress that looked like it had blood all over it as well. Their skin was extremely pale looking, and they both had dark circles around their eyes. The first thought was they needed to stop and see if these kids were okay. Followed by, there's a van full of kids who might wind up in trouble should this be anything other than a car wreck. The two on the side of the road could be running from something they had done to someone else, perhaps. The woman grabbed her cell phone and called 911. She gave out the mile marker and quick description of the pair. They never heard anything about a car wreck in the area. All they could think of is it must have been a couple of ghosts. Illinois seems to have a lot of things happening in cornfields. Then again, it has a lot of cornfields as well. In 2009, a female was attending classes at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. She was also taking horseback riding lessons, which involved driving to the country. She would drive through miles of cornfields in order to get to her horse riding classes, sometimes late at night. On many occasions, she said she would see orbs of light dancing around the corn stalks. The lights were pink, green, and yellow. They looked like really big fireflies buzzing back and forth among the crops. Just an unexplainable something to think about during her drives. One night, it was particularly dark. There was no moon to help drive the darkness away. As she was driving through the fields, she saw a huge rectangular object on her side of the road. It was blacker than the night sky, so it showed up in her headlights. As she got closer, it looked like somebody had hung a huge black door on nothing in the middle of the road. The door was about a foot off the ground. The witness thought she was just seeing things. Too many late nights studying. She rubbed her eyes and looked again. The door was still there, now a lot closer. She could see the corn on the side of the road simply vanish from sight as the black door got between her and it. The thought of a portal came to her mind. A car was coming up from behind her, and she watched as the portal got bigger as it got closer. If she didn't do something quick, she was going to find out what was on the other side of this gateway to who knows where. She pulled to the left, past the portal, and pulled back into her lane. She looked in her rearview mirror and saw the portal was gone, and the car behind her had driven right over it without anything happening. Either this portal wasn't really there, or it was meant only for her. And if it was meant only for her, why was it there? To take her somewhere? A witness from the United Kingdom, let's call him Bill, said he used to visit relatives out in the countryside every summer. On one clear day, he was out exploring with several friends and his dog. Since they were exploring, they followed a path they had never taken before. After walking for about 2 hours, they came across a cornfield. The corn was taller than their heads. Being kids, they decided to play hide and seek. When it was Bill's turn, the witness took his dog and used him to track down the other players. Yes, it was cheating, but hey, he was a kid. The dog was tracking down one of the other kids when he stopped and began to whimper. The dog moved back the way he'd come, and it began to whine and try and pull away. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. It got extremely cold. Shivering, Bill tried to hang on to his dog. The dog pulled him to the ground and the collar came off. The dog took off running away. As Bill was trying to get to his feet, he heard one of the others scream. Bill followed the sound from his friend. I'll call him Steve. He found Steve laying on the ground, hugging his legs to his chest. He was rocking back and forth. The activity looked so strange, Bill yelled for the others to come help him with Steve, who was acting weird. At the sound of his voice, Steve grabbed a rock and threw it, hitting Bill in the head. It was so stunning at first that Bill didn't even realize he'd been hit until he saw the blood. Figuring Steve had lost it, Bill turned and ran. After running a good distance, he ran into the others who had managed to catch his dog and get the leash back on. Bill told them Steve was crazy and they needed to run. So they did. You know how kids can be. They made it out of the cornfield and collapsed from exhaustion. As they lay there, trying to recover, Steve came stumbling out of the field. He looked as if he'd been in a fight with some kind of a monster. His clothes were a mess and his face was bloody. Once the gang was all back together and walking home, the story came out. Steve refused to speak to Bill. He talked to the others instead. He said he'd run into two people in the cornfield. One of them had told him that Bill was going to get someone very close to him killed. Then the second person had attacked him, causing the condition to his face and clothes. Once the kids had gotten back home, Steve became isolated from all of the others. He wanted nothing to do with any of them. Years went by, and one day Steve's mother was walking to her car when a vehicle came tearing down the road. The car would have hit Bill had she not run out and pushed him out of the way. Bill survived, but Steve's mother died after being hit by the car. Steve blamed Bill and tried attacking him, saying the guy in the cornfield had warned him that this was going to happen. I hope these stories met with your approval. If they did, let everybody know where to listen. If you want to send me a message, you can reach me at strangethings@arkanasa.com. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, the same murder three? Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.